Essential question number two is, how did the market revolution spark social change? Well, one social change that comes out of the market revolution is commercial farming, or the rise of commercial farming in the old Northwest. These are sort of like the Great Lakes states, which would have, of course, meant like the old Northwest territories that we've talked about before. But what commercial farming means is growing only one crop for sale in a cash market. And this is what the northwestern states, the old Northwest, moves toward. And this is made possible by new inventions such as John Deere's steel plow and Cyrus McCormick's horse-drawn reaper, shown here. Another social change was the dramatic growth of cities during the early 1800s as centers of course, commerce and trade, oftentimes being situated along rivers and therefore trading or commercial thoroughfares. One example might be that the cities of Cincinnati and Louisville competed for the title of Porkopolis, to be sort of a center in the trading of pigs in the pork industry. Spoiler alert, Cincinnati wins that title, which it holds to this day. Another social change sparked by the market revolution is, of course, the growth of industry. And this is one of those things that's happening in the background of some other things that we've talked about. So during the Embargo Act and the War of 1812, when the U.S. was not trading with either Britain or France, we're having to develop our own manufacturing. We're having to develop our own industry because we're no longer able to buy manufactured goods from Britain and France as we had done before. And America's growth in industry starts mostly with textiles at first, and then will of course expand to produce other products as well. Lowell, Massachusetts will be the first U.S. mill town. This will be the first town, the first major manufacturing town in the United States, and many of the processes and technologies are going to be incorporated in other U.S. mill towns and really become the foundation of U.S. industry moving forward into the rest of the 19th century. U.S. manufacturing also depended upon something called the American System of Manufacture, and this relied on something called interchangeable parts, which is another invention of Eli Whitney. But interchangeable parts is the idea that every individual piece of a product that you're making is actually the exact same size and measurements and so on. And this actually started for Eli Whitney with the production of firearms. So all the different parts of the gun would be mass produced. So all the barrels would be made exactly the same. All the trigger mechanisms would be exactly the same. The butt of the gun would all be exactly the same. And why that's different and why that's important is because items like that used to be very much specialty items that were all custom made and handmade individually. So if a part of it broke, you would have to, actually have a part special made to fit it. You couldn't just order a simple replacement part. And it also made the basic manufacturing, the first time you produce it, very hard and very time consuming as well. Now with this American system of manufacture and interchangeable parts, you can literally just have a kind of box full of one individual part and just sort of like blindly grab in and put that onto the thing that you're making. Another important social change that comes along with the rise of manufacturing in particular is that work in factories and people's work lives increasingly become governed by the clock, which means that their time is going to be very strictly separated between work time and leisure time, which really had not been the case for most American workers before the rise of manufacturing. People that worked in agrarian communities, on farms, they would be able to set their own time. They would be able to work for a little bit, take long breaks, break up their workday the way they saw fit for that particular day and the tasks at hand. But here in a factory-like setting, your life is governed by the clock. You're expected to be there at a certain time and you work until you are dismissed at a certain time, and then the rest of your day is built in for leisure or whatever else you want. Another element of having your work life governed by the clock is that wages were paid on an hourly basis. So we begin to see the institution of a wage system where people are paid a certain amount of money per hour that they work. And most American early factory work was performed by women and children rather than men. And the quintessential example of this are so-called Lowell girls, or these first employees of Lowell, Massachusetts, that first mill town that I said acted as a kind of standard and a precedent that other later mill towns followed. These Lowell girls tended to be young, unmarried women from the countryside who would come and work in Lowell for several years, make their own wages, become semi-independent before typically ultimately going back and getting married. Now, as American industry grew, a demand for industrial labor led to increased immigration into the United States. In fact, between 1840 and 1860, America welcomed in over 4 million immigrants, and most of these were German and Irish. And this is really going to be our first major wave of immigration after the foundation of the United States, and the two groups that are primarily making up this first major wave of American immigration are the Germans and the Irish. We'll start with the Irish because they made up the largest group of immigrants coming in. Many of them were fleeing the so-called potato famine in Ireland and looking for greater opportunities in other places like the United States. Most Irish immigrants were poor, and as a result they typically stayed on the East Coast in big cities like New York, Boston, etc. because they simply couldn't afford to move further inland. Most Irish immigrants worked as low-paid manual laborers, building canals and railroads and other things in the midst of that transportation revolution. And then later, prior to the Civil War, many Irish immigrants began to replace women in factories in places like Lowell and elsewhere. Now, the Germans were the second largest group of immigrants during the early 1800s, and many of them were fleeing political and economic conditions back home in Europe. Many of these were, or rather had greater financial means than the Irish did, and were able to move further west to live usually in farming communities. There they established tight-knit ethnic enclaves, and oftentimes were able to preserve much of their culture in the U.S. Immigration alarmed so-called nativists who feared the impact of immigration on American political and social life. And this is, of course, a pattern throughout American history as Americans or nativist Americans who are already here tend to react negatively to large influxes of immigrants. We'll see this here in the early 1800s, we'll see it in the late 1800s, and we really do see it today as well with the increase in Hispanic immigration into the United States. But at this time, most nativists tended to be alarmed, or especially alarmed, by the Irish because of their Catholicism. Some Germans were Catholic as well, but keep in mind that most Americans would have associated their Americanness with being Protestant, so they tended to be very anti-Catholic. Another reason that nativists opposed these immigrants, especially the Irish, is because they accused them of stealing jobs by working for lower wages, which they would oftentimes be willing to do. Irish immigrants, as a result, were subject to discrimination. No Irish Need Apply, or the acronym NINA, N-I-N-A, was very common as workplaces and industrial workplaces actually restricted hiring to non-Irish. And they were also subject to stereotyping, and they were oftentimes depicted in the popular press and in political cartoons such as this one as being similar to African American caricatures by depicting them as sort of ape-like. A final social change sparked by the market revolution is that the law was increasingly interpreted by the courts to benefit businesses. The best example of this is a Supreme Court case called Gibbons v. Ogden, which was decided in 1824. And this was, again, the Marshall Court. And remember, the Marshall Court was very much in favor of a strong national government. So here, the Marshall Court strikes down a state steamboat monopoly, saying that only the national government can decide matters of interstate trade and commerce. But the effect of this for business is that it allowed for freer operation of businesses as states were less able to make laws to govern how businesses behaved as long as they crossed state lines.